And welcome back, Wizards, to another episode of the Wizard Factory podcast, where you subscribe for weekly videos exploring deeper knowledge of the universe and yourself. We had a couple weeks off from the holidays, and we are back ready to bring you more delicious, piping hot content. My name is Logan Hart.
And I'm Brian Easterday.
And we're joined today by the lovely Susan Aurora, who is in fact my girlfriend. This is her first appearance on the show. So welcome, Susan.
Hi, thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very excited.
Oh, yeah. So those of you who follow the show, before we get started, hey, go ahead and give us a like on this video, help it get seen more in the algorithms. And if you're new here, consider subscribing, hit the notification bell. We've got brand new episodes every single week. Getting into it here today, we're going to be looking at the film, The Dark Crystal. Not the series, we're getting into that later. So we thought this would be a good place to kind of dip our feet into the allegorical breakdown world, as we announced in our last episode. And we thought we could kind of start by touching a little bit on what we got into there, just to sort of set the tone of how we're going to be approaching this episode. So Brian, would you like to take that?
Sure. Yeah. So one of the big things that we had kind of hit on in the last episode, where we talked about the power of story and mythology and why they're so effective, especially for the purpose of communicating lessons that affect our consciousness. And the reason is by creating a whole other world or another reality, and we see this in a lot of the great works, like Tolkien would be a great example, and The Dark Crystal obviously being another one, the Star Wars another great one that people would know. You create an entire other reality that a person can then kind of have almost like a little mini incarnation into. Like you can take part of your consciousness and experience that reality. Like you feel all the emotions of all the characters as they're going through that experience. But at the same time, there's a healthy distance, a healthy bit of dissociation there at the same time, where you're not actually having to go through all those experiences physically, or even, experience like a whole life of a person that's covered in a movie. It's condensed into a very small amount of time, but yet, at the same time, it's that experience that it allows you, by stepping outside your ego, can be removed from it. So Then it really gets to the subconscious and the unconscious mind and becomes very effective.
Right. And you're getting like a hyper sped up, little experience that could take a whole lifetime to live out the story, the story of these characters in the different films and stuff, but also from that protected, insulated vantage point, because it's not you on the line. You're not being judged and challenged and all these kind of things. So you don't have your own ego attached to it and your own sense of self. But again, as we've talked about before, it's a practice in empathy, because the reason people cry during movies, even though logically they know it's just actors on a set, is because they empathize, they relate to that experience, what it's like to lose someone, or what it's like to overcome a great, victory or something like that. So, Susan, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like a fake experience, for lack of a better way to put it. It's, as you said, a way to separate yourself from it. But it's interesting that Brian mentioned Tolkien, because when we were talking about it earlier, that's the first example that popped into my head, because you almost feel like it had to have been real, because it's so elaborate. The myth and the history and the stories, the families, all of that, it really does have this sense of being another reality in and of itself.
It's almost something familiar about it, isn't it?
Yes.
The Shire, that homeliness and the friendships and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's I think this is why storytelling is so woven into the human experience. Whether it's our ancient ancestors telling a story around a fire, but even in today's age, where people don't think we have that a lot, we're actually saturated in it. There's books, there's movies, there all sorts of different things. We're still constantly telling stories because that need is still there. It's a very human part to be, and then to be able to enjoy and get value from that. It shows that you have to have some kind of ability to empathize. So you are a human being. Whereas, like, if you were, say, a psychopath or something, they may not enjoy that. They're not going to empathize as much with that. you know.
You could even think, it could be a healing experience for someone. Like a movie could literally change someone's life and show them something, make them realize something that like, I'm going to choose a different, way of being from here out, or something like that. Like, it happens.
Absolutely.
Right on. So without further ado, I guess let's go ahead and get into this film, The Dark Crystal, which in my opinion is a great place to begin this trek on this podcast, because it's one of the most powerful symbolic stories, in my opinion, that I've ever seen. And, personally, I have a strong nostalgic fondness of this movie as well. I remember, watching it many times growing up, and just was so fascinated by the world and the characters and the, all of that stuff. So we're just, for the purposes of structure and flow, and so this, is enjoyable to the viewers to watch, we're basically just going to kind of follow the general storyline scene by scene and unpack the symbolism that we all have to offer each part, and as we go through, just kind of recalling from memory. So I think it goes without saying, if you've never seen this movie before, not only will there be spoilers, but it probably won't be very enjoyable for you. So I highly recommend. It's an amazing and beautiful movie, and then go and watch that first before you watch this. So the opening scene, there's some very interesting stuff right off the bat, where the narrator is sort of setting the stage for the world, and he literally says, "Another world, another time in the age of wonder." And that's the name of this episode, because I love that. And that was always an iconic thing for me as well about the movie. And, as Brian was saying, it's setting up this other world, this other time. So it's kind of creating that separation so that you can allow yourself to fully get invested in it personally. And it goes to the castle of the Skeksis, which are these creatures that look like part bird, part reptile, like crocodile, lizardy, and even birds. They say, vulture, definitely.
Yeah, that's a good way to describe them.
And I think just that is very symbolic, because it's like, scavenger, bottom feeder, reptilian, obviously very cold-blooded, lacking empathy, lacking care, just very mechanical, kind of that, left brain masculine mentality, if you will, really. And obviously this is going to be one of the biggest themes for me going throughout the movie and the series as well. Is I think one of the most profound things about this is just how interesting of an allegory the Skeksis are in general, how accurately they depict the mindset, the lifestyle, the everything that is exuded by these creatures parallels the whatever you want to call them, the elites, the owners of society, the social engineers.
What's interesting about your description of the Skeksis is that in that intro, when they're setting the scene, they say the cruel Skeksis imprisoned within themselves in a dying land. But as we see later on, the Skeksis' view of themselves is very pompous, very ego-driven. They think they're beautiful and they're very vain. But the narrator sets it up as like they're imprisoned within themselves. So it's almost like a ruse, Well,
and the irony is that just like the actual living elites in our world, they're obsessed with immortality. And they're always talking about, we live forever, we're the guardians of the crystal. And that's why you'll see later, without getting into too much depth about the series, but they're very freaked out by death. The fact that one of them can die scares the crap out of them, because that goes again. It's like the cognitive dissonance of how they see themselves.
Well, and I think it's very interesting that they see themselves in such a wonderful light, so to speak. But then if you look at them, they're very sick. They always have like the characters, and they like the mucus like coming out of their nose. They're just very, very ill looking. I mean, and when you look at some of the powers that should not be, I guess, so to speak, or people as they get older, they look very terrible, and it shows you that kind of karmic backlash, from living that kind of style. But what I also think is very interesting about the Skeksis is that they are one part of other creatures, which are the mystics. So for every mystic, there's a Skeksis, because they're split halves of themselves. So you see the mystics are kind of like very far into what would be the right brain, or just the natural, the intuitive, they're still practicing magic. And whenever the split happened was when the crystal was originally broken. Yeah, at the first conjunction, which we'll get into that and stuff. But that's, then these beings split themselves, and they went to the different extremes, the polarized extremes.
It's almost like in quantum physics, the quantum position, where one molecule can exist simultaneously, but if one goes, the other go. And you see that early in the movie where, there's one, the emperor of the Skeksis, and the wisest is what they call them, of the mystics, are on their deathbed, and they're kind of withering away. But I guess in order to kind of stay on track here, we were talking about the opening scene where we see all the Skeksis in the crystal room, and they're using the sun to charge the crystal, and then it shoots out and goes into their eyes.
It's almost like a form of meditation.
Well, we were talking about this last night, Susan, is that it's like they're stealing the energy from the sun because they don't know how to generate that intrinsic divine soul spark. So they're tapping into the crystal and using something kind of outside themselves to get their energy. If they're not getting that, that's when they start like aging faster, and you see as things go on, it's because the crystal stops working in the way that they're using it in this beginning of this the movie, that they have to actually start harvesting the Gelfling for essence as well. So more of that theme of they have to feed. They're like parasites.
Well, and if you look, allegorical, we talk about on the show a lot. If you look at the sun as a representation of the soul, and if you see they're using this this ritual of the sun in order to feed on it, and if you could see that symbolically as them feeding on soul energy or soul essence, because it's something that they feel they're lacking themselves, because they're split, they're fractalized, and as you say, that eventually then leads into them harvesting life force essence, soul essence from the beings themselves, because remembering here in the movie, the crystal is the heart of Thra, the planet that all these beings are living on. And I also think it's interesting to note that you were saying of how fearful the Skeksis are of death. And you notice in the beginning, when the emperor is dying, whenever his corpse dies, he kind of crumbles away. They're terrified about it. Whenever you see the wisest, the master die, they kind of fade. And so even when they're passing, there's a difference kind of, you can just see that their reaction to it. The mystics notice it and then just move on, whereas the Skeksis are very fearful of it.
And the emperor was like, I'm still emperor, and the mystic was just like, goodbye, son, and just peacefully went.
That's right. Yeah, like faded He's out. Almost clinging to his power in the. That's why the real elite are so obsessed with immortality, because they don't want to face their karmic being recycled, and two, it's all about sacrificing their soul, selling their soul to the devil for material wealth, power, possessions, status, all that kind of stuff. So of course they're going to be clutching it to their very dying breath. But also, I guess we can go ahead and open this, because this is going to be a really big theme. I think is we can just go ahead and dive into this duality concept that it paints right from the beginning, is that the crystal cracked, and then these beings turned into two, one for one. And it's very much the masculine and feminine polarities. As you can see, the Skeksis are the left brain, like I said earlier, the bird-like, the reptilian brain, as well as they live in a castle which is very phallic shaped, in a rocky mountainous area, this big phallic castle that they live in. And then the mystics actually live in a valley, which is feminine, the V for vagina, valley, where water runs down, water being feminine and grows life and all that kind of stuff. And even the way they die, I thought was indicative, is that the Skeksis turn to dust, which is the material part. The mystics go into the ether. It's like they sort of disappear. They represent spirit. So, you know, earth and spirit being those kind of polarity elements there.
I thought it was interesting too, the color of the crystal, because if you see the shard, the original crystal is actually clear, but the dark crystal is dark because of the way it's been used, and the color purple being, you know, third eye crown, the spirit, and that being the thing that the Skeksis are lacking, because that has all been removed and is with the mystic side. And so the fact that, you know, not only is the crystal turning purple, but that is actually what they're consuming. The essence is purple. That's the spirit. That's the thing they're lacking, the soul of the sun, as Brian put it. So I thought that was interesting, even the color that they chose.
All the creatures that get the darkening, their eyes turn purple as well. Like it's almost like they're possessed by that. It's the mind virus that me and Brian talk a lot about. It's they're infected with something very sinister energetically, and that purple being the color of royalty. You know, it's that twisted. It's, you know, they're taking that crown chakra, which is supposed to be divine, but they're twisting it as the divine right to rule that we've heard of from the ruling class for thousands of years, you know.
And I think that mentality takes you, that left brain mentality takes you farther away from spirit, and so that creates that that need, that lack that has to be invoked with the color, you know.
Yeah, when they're using the sun from the crystal, it's going into their eyes. So, like, that's pretty symbolic too. It's like,
they say, you know, the eyes are the gateway to the soul. So, you know, that'd be very, you know,
totally.
very interesting. I also think it's kind of interesting if you look at the duality of these Skeksis and the mystics, looking at from like the occult perspective, we could very much see these Skeksis being the dark occultists, whereas the mystics would be the occultists or guardians of sacred knowledge for the purpose of preserving. And I think it's interesting to note that if you see the frame of how the Skeksis actually came into power and everything, that there were guardians of the crystal. You know,
so you have this dichotomy of the Skeksis and the mystics, and I also thought it was very deliberate, obviously, in how they set up the story for all three. The three main players is the Skeksis, the mystics, and then Jen being the main character, because to me it symbolized the Trinity, you know, the Father and the Mother creating the Son, you know, the Son of God kind of thing. Being is that, you know, it talks about, first it shows the Skeksis, they have the Emperor is dying, and you know, the narrator says the ritual brings them no comfort because on this day their Emperor is dying. Then it shows the mystics, and they're doing it. I also thought it was interesting. It says, numbly rehearsing the ancient ways in a blur of forgetfulness. So even they have lost their connection to, because remember, Thra is sick. They're just kind of going through the motions of like their practices, their rituals, just for the sake of doing them, but they're not really connected. And then it says, even this day, their rituals bring them no comfort because the wisest is dying. And then it pans to Jin, who's playing naked, playing his flute next to a little pond, just totally one with nature, playing music, which is natural law, you know. And it says, but his flute gives him no comfort because his master, not in the dominating kind of way, but his mentor master is dying as well. So it's like the Skeksis is sort of the you know, the inauthentic or the toxic masculinity, the mystics being the, you know, the feminine aspect, and then Jen is kind of like the Jesus or Odin character, just sort of that synthesis of the two becoming one in the form of Gelfling, which I feel represents human beings.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, because you see the Gelfling are actually the natural creatures and inhabitants of Thra. Right. You know, they say, you know, early on when they're setting up everything, that these beings, you know, they came from the stars, they came from another place, you know, to Thra, and then that's when they became the guardians of the crystal and things.
And one like quick little side note too, I noticed that in the beginning of the movie there were 10 of each, but the one is dying on each side. So the 10 dies. Think about what is a 10? It's a 1 and a 0, masculine and feminine. The 10 dies, and then it becomes 9, which is the downward spiral. So it's like the cycle beginning again. And that's when the mystics know that it's time they start making this trek back to the crystal, back to the castle where the crystal is, because they know it's all been prophesized.
Yeah.
So,
and they begin to ohm, actually. When they do that ohm symbol, the narrator says they are summoning the one who must save them. And then they leave to go to the castle. And I thought it was,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, I thought that the scene with Jen by the waterfall playing the flute was very kind of Garden of Eden-esque, was the energy that I got from it. He's nude, like you said, very much in his element in nature.
And the narrator says, this is a time of testing. Every 1,000 years, the world must be healed or passed forever into the rule of evil. And that right there is definitely very indicative of this time that we're in, where it's this precipice. It's a turning point where obviously sovereignty reigns no matter what. It's up to us to decide, what are we going to choose collectively as a human species to elevate and to take in proper knowledge and to ascend through that, or allow tyranny and the complete ignorance of true morality to just completely let everything collapse into chaos and disrepair.
And I think it's interesting Jin as a character to understand, like in his backstory, because if you understand, this is kind of like his hero's journey. This whole movie is Jin's hero's journey. And his backstory is that the Skeksis actually had slayed his family. He thought he was actually the last Gelfling left. He didn't know any others existed. So that was kind of like his setup. And then he had since then been raised by the wisest of the mystics or whatever as a student. So I think that's very interesting to see that he's, as a hero, like as many of us in life go through our hero's journey, maybe coming from a background of having that trauma or that pain. And it's this quest that is part of this process of going through this healing, of finding one's true self and all that. So I think that's a very good way to kind of set him up as a character. To kind of go through this quest. He's been waiting to kind of, not so much to get revenge, but you could say to like balance the scales. There's been a wrong done to him by the Skeksis, and now there's an opportunity to go and not only like from his own personal perspective do healing, but heal all of Thra.
Right, and I was going to add that even his name, Jin, the Latin of generare is to create, and when as I said before, he's sort of that son, the offspring of the masculine and feminine, is what, when masculine and feminine comes together, that is the creative force of nature. Like that is, so he is Jin or Jinari to create, and then they set it up saying the journey of Jin. So his quest is to the journey of Jin, like to come back into that creative force, bringing the masculine and feminine into balance.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
and as the mystic is the wisest of the mystics, who is Jin's mentor, is kind of giving him his quest and talking to him. He says, the story runs deeper than you know, and you are a part of it.
Yeah.
Right.
That was a very interesting part.
Personal responsibility, kind of like in Cloud Atlas. Like everyone has that small role to play, but this tiniest actions ripple out through, eternity.
Yeah, or the example of like Frodo and Bilbo, in the Lord of the Rings, being part of Ringbearers. That the story goes much deeper than they know, but they're a part of it. And that's a theme that we see repeated in all these heroes' journeys, and it's because that's how it is. Our story, our history goes much deeper than we all know, and we're all a part of it. We're all part of continuing to make it happen. I also think it's interesting, Susan, when you were talking about the mystics had put out the call for the one that would, come save everything, come save Thra, that they were all kind of chanting, like, this kind of sound, this humming sound. But they're doing it, and they're in this area that there's all this, if you look at the scene, there's all this kind of megalithic stonework. and things. You see like a lot of spirals and things. You know, it reminds you just very much of like megaliths and things like that. And this idea of stone kind of holding energy, or that, you know, that's part of Thra, and then they know how to actually tune that into to send the entire call out through all of Thra. So I mean, they put so much detail into this scene, because you know, this movie it's interesting. A lot of people kind of look at it, and because it's puppets, they're like, that's weird, and then they just, you know, kind of shut it off right there and dismiss it. But if you start looking at like all the detail that they put into everything, realizing that was all like handcrafted stuff, you know, that it really goes to show you like what a magical act it was to actually go and create this other reality in order to play out this story, you know.
Yeah.
Very interesting to know.
Yeah, and I like what you said about the rocks and the megaliths, and I even noticed that where the mystics live, it kind of looked like almost a Stonehenge that they had going on. And the crystal itself, the movie is all about the dark crystal, and as we know, quartz, which is what it looks like when it's not darkened, holds information. So to me, the crystal is almost like it's the crystal of truth, but it's the knowledge. It retains the information of truth. And without that, there's that hidden piece, the shard that's been removed, which, you know, Logan will get into later, his theory about that, which is very interesting. But the crystal itself being this representation of Thra, of the earth, you know, in this physical form. But crystals themselves holding that information.
Yeah, well, and they say that in the movie too, that, you know, the crystal is the heart of Thra, you know, so it's, it makes sense that the energy, all the essence, you know, the heart space, the place where the soul sits, you know, is, you know, stored in this crystal that looks very much like quartz. And like you said, quartz, we know, can store, you know, almost infinite amounts of information in it. It's very interesting in its structure that it's actually, you know, constantly vibrating. So I think, you know, it's very, very symbolic. You know, it definitely was chosen on purpose to illustrate this. Absolutely. I also think that.
Go ahead.
Sorry, she was mentioning that, you know, when the master's kind of telling him, you know, giving him this this mission, saying, you know, that, you know, you're the one that the prophet said you're supposed to find the shard. He responds with something very simple, and it's, but master, I'm only a gelfling. Like, and I thought that was like kind of very impactful in the sense that, you know, many times if you're going on one of these journeys, or, you know, you see that the character in a story, that they feel called to do something that they feel is so much bigger than themselves. Like
they're like, well, what can I do?
That. Right, what can I do? I'm just me. I'm just so small. But they don't really actually realize how utterly powerful they really are. And I think that's, you know, a very interesting thing to note, because I think that's probably something many of us can resonate with, of having felt small or powerless, or like there was something that we couldn't accomplish when we were called to do something a lot bigger.
Right.
Yeah, so, I really like when he says, I'm not ready to go alone, too, when he begins the journey, and then he goes, all right, alone then, like, no one can do this but me.
Right, I'm the one I've been waiting for, exactly.
Yes.
Because that's part of growing up, too, is just learning, you know, you've been given all the skills and taught the lessons, hopefully, by your parents, if they're halfway, you know, worth their salt. And at some point, growing up just means, okay, I'm on my own now. Like, literally, you know, it's not that they won't help you. It's that you need to learn to just rely on yourself and not just expect them, that learned helplessness, to come swoop in and save you every time you get, you know, caught in the brambles or whatever. So moving on in the storyline, we come to the part where the emperor has died of the Skeksis, and it's time for them to choose a new emperor. And I just thought that the way that they do this, their process is very, very, you know, obviously symbolic of the political process. It's so very just cutthroat and competitive, and, you know, a total lack of care for the other fellow man. It's all about, I want that power, I want that throne, that scepter, and that's a very kind of toxic masculine thing. As we've said, this is going to be a big theme with the Skeksis, is this very toxic masculine archetype. And the way that they determine the new ruler, when there's two that are contesting it, is trial by stone, which they have this big kind of obelisk looking thing, very phallic as well, and then two swords, which are phallic. And it's basically like a symbolically, like a dick measuring contest, because it's about who can take their sword and whack the stone the hardest, you know?
Yeah. Well, and I thought it was really, that scene was very interesting, because you see that it really frames the mindset of the Skeksis. It's all about power. It's all about wanting control and wanting to be the one that's on top so they can do whatever they want. So they're always fighting amongst themselves. But the one, there's the Emperor dies, and then, these two Skeksis, they challenge each other to this trial by stone. And the one who loses, afterwards, they strip him of all his clothes, because you see in their costumes, the Skeksis, they wear these very big, bulky
ornate,
costumes, and
kind of extravagant.
Very ornate. You think they're actually kind of large creatures, but when they strip him down, he's like just this tiny, withered, like nasty looking little thing, And I think that's very interesting to note that you see how like withered they are. That everything that they do is all about creating this illusion, this appearance that they have this power, they have this majesty, this majesty, when really they're just these withered, powerless, sickly little creatures that are dying, and they're utterly afraid of that.
Exactly.
Right, but they're guardians of the crystal, like.
Right. Yeah.
It's the divine right to rule. It's we're this, I'd say almost like, we're of the gods, the Anunnaki hybrid, that kind of stuff, even because not to get too into it, but we do touch into that you find out the Skeksis aren't from Thrall, that they came from the stars. I mean, that's pretty straightforward, obviously.
Absolutely.
And yeah, like the way the loser of that competition gets stripped of his status, his clothing, his, and they basically exile him. Very indicative of the political process of it's just this, essentially what comes down to a poop slinging contest. And it's about who can make the most shit stick to the other guy. And, and usually after the end of a term, when they've outlived their usefulness, so to speak, they compromise them. There's some scandal that comes out. I mean, like, look for Arnold Schwarzenegger, for example. He was governor for a couple of terms in California. And then next thing you know, there's this scandal that comes out that he has illegitimate child with the maid or whatever. It's like they use you and then they just cast you aside so that people are just like, oh, get them out of there. Just another corrupt politician. But they're really all like that. Okay, so basically next, Jin has this actually the crystal shows the Skeksis Jin, so it shows them that there's a Gelfling still alive. And then the Skeksis order the Garthim, these hybrid creatures that are like these giant beetle soldiers, to go and apprehend
crab-like, kind of,
crabby, they're military.
Kind of yeah, definitely your order followers.
Yeah.
And I just thought it was interesting, this theme too, how the crystal is kind of like the seeing stones in like Lord of the Rings or something.
The Palantir.
But yes. It's the crystal of truth, right? So it's showing truth. It's sharing information, like looking into it, and you see that later with the crystal bats that are basically like the surveillance drones that send the information back to the crystal, so the Skeksis can see everything that's happening. Very, very interesting. And later too, you see the crystal shard show Jen something as well. So it
doesn't discriminate. The truth doesn't discriminate. The truth is present for all, good and bad.
Yes,
and so that's what I took from that, because I was thinking, why would the crystal show? Because this crystal calls the Skeksis. Remember that siren goes off and they're like, the crystal, and they start going towards it. And I was thinking, wouldn't the crystal know that that's actually not good for it? But it's the truth, like you said, and it's available to all.
The truth is objective. It's just information.
Exactly.
That's all it is.
Yeah, I just got hit with something. So the idea that if you look at it from the perspective like the dark occultist, so, even in our world, we can see that this knowledge has been hoarded, and that's much like what the Skeksis were doing. They were keeping the crystal to themselves, away from everybody. They were hoarding it. and Jen only had access to a shard of it, like a tiny little fractal of it, but yet it still performs the same purpose. And I think that's a great allegory for, us. Even if you just can find the smallest shred of truth, the smallest little shard of that, and you can tap into that, that's still an access point,
because truth is all one thing. It's like
exactly.
like you said, an access point. It's the tapestry. It's all connected.
Right. Yeah.
Like
exactly. So I think that's very interesting that they even just gave him a shard of the crystal.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'll definitely be getting into what I think the shard versus the crystal represent more specifically, but that's a little bit later. So now basically, Jen has this quest, right? He's got all he knows is I'm supposed to do this, and the master gives him these very vague, follow the greatest son to the house of Agra, and he even says, he's like, oh, some directions, he's like, what the hell? He starts doubting himself. He's like wandering through, there's all these strange creatures and plants and stuff, and he's just like, what am I even doing here? Like, how did this find me? Who am I? And then just as he's doubting himself, he doesn't realize that he's hot on the trail and about to actually find the home of Agra. He gets tangled in these tentacle vine things that hang him upside down. And interestingly enough, the first thing you see is a hand holding an eyeball like this right in his face. And it's Agra, and she's talking to him. And Susan had a really interesting insight about what she says. So, before we get into that, Agra is the divine feminine, but specifically the mother energy. There's different depictions, you can see, but she's very much that nurturing, but protective, and genuinely caring.
Like
it really comes down to, it really comes down to the care aspect. Agra in this movie specifically, I think, embodies the care aspect, the principle, and we'll see that more in depth. But yes, so Susan, you want to get into what she says, the very first words out of her mouth?
Yeah, and as you said, she's this divine feminine, and she's this mother figure. So it's interesting that the first thing that she would say is, "Are you afraid of me?" And then she's like, "Think I'm going to eat you?" And the first thing that popped into my head was that fear of the divine feminine. She's this very witchy woman. She's very spiritual, and also being that mother, but she's very old and very kind of, decrepit and things like that. So
she's really unsightly. Like, she looks like a goblin or something. And I'm thinking like Mother Hela or Kali is a very fearsome female archetype. It's kind of like that. Think I'm going to eat you? Well, Kali is the consumer of worlds. Like, very interesting.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. And, so in the scene, he meets Agra, and then, she takes him into her little kind of, her living space or her shelter. And there you see this this kind of massive machine.
The
Ori.
The Ori, yeah. So you see this Ori, and what it is essentially an astronomical machine. It shows the movements of all the planets and the stars and things like that. And you kind of get a little bit of a backstory there, that you see this machine is what the Skeksis actually had given her in exchange for them, taking over the crystal. So she kind of went into this trance-like, state where she's, projecting she talks about, she's projecting her consciousness out into the universe and exploring all the stars. And that's why she was away for an age, a trine, I believe, they call it, or 1,000 trine. And, so she's out there in the universe learning all these things, and she has this machine, but she's, talking to him and explaining, this is how you predict things. She's like, she's talking about the old conjunction when the crystal was first split, and the three suns came together, and then another one is coming. She's like, this is how I know. She's like, how else would I know?
Because she says it's really, either the end of the world or the beginning.
All the same. She's like, beginning, all the same.
Yeah.
She says, everything in the heavens is here, law of correspondence, moving as the heavens move, which that's natural law right there. And then she's pointing to the Ori and says, this is how to know when, prophecy, it's a mathematical science.
Right.
Astrology is a mathematical science. It predicts the great conjunction, and she knows about it.
Right. Well, and I even think, from obviously as an astrologer, this very much interested me in the movie, that they incorporate this science into it, and it's a great conjunction. When you see three suns coming together, which, you can see that, from an astrological perspective being very symbolic, and that, it's by observing the stars and the cycles that you can recognize what energetic changes are happening. And a change could either, they say it over and over again in the movie, how these changes, it's not necessarily good or bad. It can be either. It's sometimes good, sometimes bad.
Yeah, she does say that.
Yeah, exactly. And it's, so you can recognize that. And we very much right now are going through similar things. Like, we've had a lot of very interesting astrological events over 2019. It was been a very interesting year with a lot of things happening, and moving into 2020, we also have some very, interesting conjunctions and things coming up. So I just find it so interesting that, in this world, this other reality, it's supposed to be, fake and it's all fiction, but yet there, you see more truth in this than you will see out like in most of society, and that, it is important to notice these cycles and to look for these things. And you can actually use that as a way to predict, to be aware and know when these changes are coming. So because it can go either way. So if you're not aware of it, it's probably going to go the way you don't want it to. It was the Skeksis, by them hiding what they were doing, everybody not knowing, remaining in ignorance, that they were allowed to get to the point that they did. So by being observant of these things, coming into an awareness of them, you can then predict these cycles and then work with that. So you're actually directing it in a proper way. You're making it a good change, because the opportunity is there for either, and it's up to us to choose which way we want to shift that.
Yeah, and it's like the Ouroboros, cycles and circles, like end, beginning. It's all the same as the tail is the head. It's just everything starts over. It's like the Yira, just the relationship of all things being connected, just like that machine. Just everything's winding. Circles there's fast ones, and then there's big long ones, but everything's all just kind of blending together and being part of the all. So next, there's Jen at Augra's house, and she's, talking about astrology and the Great Conjunction. And then she comes out with this big box of crystals and just dumps this pile of shards in front of him. Again, before the next Great Conjunction, that when the three suns align, the crystal must be healed. They're very specific with the word healed. Heal, as we know from the Germanic, we talked about this in the rune, because we have Hagalaj and Hala, Hela. It's all coming from the same word. It means to be whole. So to heal is to not have dis-ease. It means you're whole or you're healed. And so the truth is fractured right now. It's like the schism, like I talk about in my natural law seminar. It's that fracturing of the truth, like looking into a shattered mirror, where you're seeing different versions, different angles, perspectives of the one truth. The truth is in front of the mirror, but the mirror doesn't seem to agree. It's that fractalization, that kind of schism there. And then, it's this pile of crystals she gives him. She doesn't tell him which one. Actually, she doesn't know. So he says, how do I know which one? And she says, I don't know. So it's up to Jen to figure out which one. And I think it's interesting. He narrows it down to 3 crystals. There's that number 3 again. He's like, I know it's one of these 3, but which one? And the way that he discovers the correct one is he plays his flute and the one crystal starts glowing that purple color again, which I thought was sort of pointing towards resonance and sound frequency, and like speaking the languages of the universe. And what truth resonates. When you hear truth, you resonate with it. So it's like your soul glows like that crystal does, of like, oh, I resonate with this.
Well, it even kind of like flashes a scene of the mystics, and they kind of, they're doing that kind of resonating sound. And then you see that like he also kind of gets like that ping. So that kind of, to me, kind of hits on like paying attention to your ancestral guides and things like that.
He knew to do that because he remembered the mystics doing that, and then he starts playing it.
Right, and then I also think with Audra, it's interesting to know, like when she dumps out this box of crystals, and he's like, how do I know which one? She's like, I don't know, even though she's been, this wise guardian, was the guardian of the crystal, and Thrawn is this great mystic. She still doesn't know everything, like there's a change coming, but you don't know how it's going to play out, and it's kind of that interesting situation that you encounter as you gain more and more knowledge and insight, that you can start to see these cycles and these shifts, but then you see that it's just potential is always there. You never know how it's going to play out exactly. So it's the more you know, the less you know. So I think it's kind of also very interesting to note that she doesn't even have all the answers. That if he really wants that answer, he has to go within.
Right. I even kind of wondered if she knew. And that was a test for Jen, that she was like, well, I know which one it is, but do you?
Yeah, that's a very interesting insight as well to consider. Yeah,
quite possible. Agra is kind of sneaky sometimes, and sort of kind of Loki-ish in a little bit. Like
very much
that sort of ornery, mischievous side to her, which I like. She's
absolutely.
She's by far my favorite character. She's just so complex and rich. So I guess this would be a good time to kind of introduce my my personal what I got hit with as a interpretation of the crystal of truth and the crystal shard, and then you guys can by all means reflect off of that. So I think that the crystal of truth represents the knowledge of the universe, like the physical laws of nature, technology, science, things like that, which is very powerful and valuable, of course. We live in the universe. And it's sort of the macrocosm of knowledge. And then the crystal shard represents knowledge of self, which is the microcosm. And that's the part that's been, think about it, disconnected. Where we're at with the society, we have all this technology and advancements and space travel and all this crazy, amazing achievements, but zero knowledge of self as a whole. This is a generality that I'm speaking. Not everyone is like this, but as in the aggregate, as it were, we are devastatingly lacking self-awareness, knowledge of even our own behavior, but the archetypes and the psychology and that aspect of it. A lot of the stuff that we get into on this show is why we're doing this podcast, because we see it as of vital importance to understand this. Every human being should have a good understanding of the laws of nature and the laws of self, which are essentially one and the same. But to tie it all together, the shard must be reintegrated into the crystal of truth, or healed. And that's what the Skeksis lack. That's why they have to get it from the sun. They have no self-awareness or self-knowledge. They're incredibly disconnected from themselves. But now Jen has it. See, and that's why they're so scared of Jen, this little old gelfling, what can I do? Yet it's making the Skeksis quiver in fear, because that's what he has, knowledge of self.
Yeah. Oh, that's excellent. I definitely agree with that take on it, because that's very much what I got from it, was that the crystal represents the fractalization, the splitting of not only of ourselves as individuals, but ourselves from that cosmic law, that truth. So that's definitely very on point, I think, with your interpretation of that. And it's very much, that's why they use that word, that crystal has to be healed, because it's a healing process of self-integration. Like, you have to reintegrate yourself back into cosmic law. And it's interesting to note that you as a shard, when it's integrated back, helps complete the whole, helps complete the all. Like
because you're a shard of the all. It's that fractal,
exactly,
like the little piece of the all. But yeah, it's I love that you said that. You have to reintegrate yourself back into truth, because why do you think the unhealed person rejects truth? Because it's literally facing them with that aspect of themselves that they have compartmentalized because of trauma. They're not even whole within themselves, much less with everything else.
Yeah. And if you look at the shard as, a fractal of us, just like we're fractals of the all, like we were talking about earlier, as it's still an access point. And that's the key. Like, you are the access point, like, to be able to see and, to get all the information that you need to. You still have the access to that. It's within yourself. And, you see that theme played over and over again here, with Jen, like we were talking about, when he's trying to select which shard is correct. He had to go inside himself to be able to do that.
Right. Well, and as Brian pointed out about Agra's story, and, she was distracted by technology and this external search with the orrery, away from caring for the crystal, away from being connected to Thra. So even she, the divine mother, was still susceptible to this thirst for knowledge of something external, looking to the stars for answers. And to me, the orrery, the machine, is corrupting the divine feminine by taking her away from her own connection to source. And maybe that's why she didn't know which shard was which. Maybe that's legitimately what was happening there, because she had disconnected herself for so long. She'd been gone for 1,000 trying.
Right. Yeah, that's a very interesting observation. And I think it's also interesting to note that when the Skeksis, they offered her the machine, it's a very mechanical, it's a mechanical thing. It's very left brain. It's very logical. It's science based. And then if you look at the technology of Thra, like that the mystics use and everything, it's very earth based. They're using the stones and the rocks,
their
and
voice,
plants, and their voice, and then there's
organic.
Very organic. Even like the creatures that the Gelfling and everything that they kind of like have helped them along the way. They come out of the forest. Whereas the Skeksis, they take like some creatures and what's naturally there, and then they make this like little machine, this carriage that they then roll. Have these what look like little roly polies that kind of roll them along, but they do it through kind of controlling them, and
it's
not
a dominant.
Right,
all the animals are like
right.
in cages, and they're doing experiments on them and just enslaving them to their will. Whereas they're, you see with the protagonists of the story, they know how to call upon nature, and it's there to help them. It's there to support them. They just call in their jungle friends, basically.
So it's again that very like that natural, or that symbiotic, that natural, or what you could even say is the animist or like pagan mindset versus the
monotheistic,
controlling, destructive, domineering kind of mindset.
The darkening.
Right.
Absolutely. That's what they call it.
It's the mind virus. And I made that parallel as well. When you see that the mystics use these monolithic that kind of look like Stonehenge, and there's like the pagan animistic type thing, and the Skeksis are very much like that sort of monotheistic, monarchic, like one emperor to rule and all that. Very mono-ish, just generally.
Yeah, well, just the difference between like the emperor and the wisest
one, right? It's not about I'm in the undisputed seat of power through domination. It's I have the most to actual offer value to offer my tribe, and so they elevate me through that as the wisest of the mystics. So now we see the journey really starting to unfold. Jen has followed the mystery. He's followed his curiosity and the guidance of his ancestors, his teachers, and has now, and the greatest son to the home of Agra, to have now found the divine feminine mother of care. So he meets her, and the divine feminine mother of care gives him his self-discovery. in the form of the crystal shard. So now he's found himself. But then what's his next question? Well, now I have it. What do I do with it? Okay, I found myself, but now what do I do? You know, so it's just so beautiful to see this this unfolding. I also thought it was interesting. I'm curious, Brian, what your take is that Aughra's missing one eye. I thought that was kind of Odin-like.
Oh, yeah, very much so. That I think that's very symbolic too. And you know, I also think, as you were saying, that you know he follows the greatest sun, which if you're looking at the soul, you know, you're following the greatest source, the soul, and that leads him to that divine mother, that Kara, who has this, you know, this one-eyed kind of symbolic stance. You know, she's very kind of out there, you know, what would be considered like on the fringes of a character. You know, she's got like horns, you know, like I said, she's kind of very raggedy looking, you know.
Well, she's very witchy too, which I'm glad you brought that. She's got crystals and astrology and, like you said, horns, like very, very pagan, witchy, that sort of
you know. So that's very interesting that, you know, he ends up finding this source of Kara, this feminine energy, by following the path of his soul. You know, you could say that's like getting on your orlog. And then by finding what you care about, you know, that's then when you discover yourself. And then, okay, now I've discovered myself. Where are we going? So I thought, you know, there's so much symbology, you know, in this. And,
well, and how did he discover, you know, which shard? Obviously, playing the flute, but how did he know to play the flute? He was sitting there looking at the three and asking himself questions. He's on a quest. How do you follow a quest? You ask the right questions. And then it's led him to discover himself. So he says, now that I've found the shard, what do I do with it? Do I take it somewhere? What's so special about this shard? That's literally some of his quotes there. So the divine spark as a part of the whole, you know, is what that's representing. So let's see here. Moving on to the Gartham now break into Aughra's home and burn her house down, basically. And Jen doesn't see what happened to her. He just, you know, they all run out, and he's basically alone again by himself. He has the shard now, but now he's just like, okay, now what? So, you know, and then the crystal calls the mystics back to the castle. This is the part where, you know, the crystal calls to the Skeksis earlier, and now you see it calls to the mystics too, and then they say, it's now time to return. They know this is all part of the cycle that's happening, and they begin their trek there. And then you have Jen alone in the forest, and he's again questioning himself, and the crystal, and he's saying, you know, like, so what's so special about this shard? And that's when the crystal shows him the vision of the crystal actually be broken by the Skeksis and fragmented. And then that's when he hears a noise, which it turns out to be a Fizzgig, the furry little ball of teeth, basically. Like, and then Kira, the female Gelfling. So supposedly now they're the only two Gelfling left in all of Thra, the male Jin and now Kira the female, and they meet each other, and then they dream fast. And I thought this would be a good scene to get into because there was a lot of symbolism there. Dream fasting is where they put something that only Gelfling can do. They put their hands together and they can literally like kind of revisit or see each other's memories. And they get to know each other just by seeing how they were raised, you know. And again, it's significant because these are supposedly the last two Gelflings. So how did they survive this Holocaust, so to speak, through the Garthian and the Skeksis, and how were they brought up being the only one, like, you know, being brought up by creatures that were not like them, and, you know, that kind of, they connected it that way. But you see that Kira was taught to speak with animals and use flowers and herbs and all that natural kind of feminine sort of stuff. And Jen was taught about words, symbols, numbers, you know, mathematics, basically, that kind of taught what a masculine, you know, figure would. Yeah. You guys want to add anything to that?
Absolutely. No, I think it's very interesting that, you know, he encounters this another form of the feminine energy, because as you spoke about earlier, you know, Aughra represents kind of that older, that motherly kind of energy, and this is more the younger, the divine feminine, that would be like kind of more of a completion of himself. But I think it's very interesting when they're dream fasting. The way they do it, they kind of they blur their memories that are like going back and forth. Like you kind of hear both of them talking at the same time, and it's very interesting to actually, in the regards of in our dreams, that we can act. You know, the idea of communication, that this is a very possible thing, and that it's going both ways, and it's not just it's not a linear kind of communication like this would be, like where one person says one thing, the other person responds. It's a back and forth, all happening simultaneously. So I thought that was very interesting how they did that scene. I think it was very on point in how the dream world and communication in that regards can kind of work. And that's a very, they also, you know, is kind of like they're condensing all their life memories, all their shared experiences down into this like one event that can then just be shared in a short period of time, and to get that basis of knowing another or foundation laid. So it's a very interesting scene to look at.
Yeah, and even though it's a very brief history of each character, I think that they did a really good job of aligning all of the points, because Kira was raised by the podlings, who are essentially like children. And so when we think of children, we say, you know, children are more connected to source. They're, you know, they don't have all this conditioning. They're not so far removed. So it makes sense that Kira would be learning those more source related, you know, talents or, you know, skills of still being connected to Earth. And even her character is a little more playful and lighthearted, whereas Jen was raised by an elder, you know, an older creature who had all this knowledge to share, and was, you know, also had this knowledge of the next 1,000 years passing. He knew that he was going to need to be prepared for this journey, and I think that maybe even the mystic knew that he was the one that they would call for. But he's very serious and, you know, more structured, and even the races that I believe that they come from, which we learn more about later on in the series, has something to do with the way that their personalities and their roles were placed as well.
Yeah, that's an excellent observation.
Definitely, because it's like teaching him the sort of the adulting skills, like balancing his checkbook and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and what I noticed about the little, you know, the creatures that raise her, you know, like you're saying, they're very childlike. But I also noticed that when she brings him back to meet all of them, you know, there's kind of this very festive scene going on. Like they're kind of partying, and, you know, they're playing music and dancing and, you know, just having a good time. And you can see that even though it's kind of what a lot of people would look at as like a simple culture, like it's very nature based, it's very pagan, you know, it's a country culture, right? But it's very rich. Like it has the music, and there's that wunjo, that joy and family of like being a tribe. And I think it's very interesting to note that even though the blackening is happening, even though the Skeksis have ruled for 1,000 trine, and they seem to be in control of everything and poisoning Thra itself, yet still this rich culture is still there. It's still to be found, even if it's in a small contained place. And you notice they live deep in the forest. You know, they're deep within, you know, Thra, like, you know, in that mother kind of nature.
Right. And they still choose to have celebrations and be joyful, even though they're constantly getting abducted and stuff like that.
As Kira says, they always come, but they're still, so this isn't anything new for them, but they still find the ability to come together as family and celebrate life.
Right.
So, you know, we're actually almost to that part in the overall timeline as well with the Pod People Village. But basically, so you know, the Gartham have taken Aughra, and he shows the Skeksis all feasting. You know, again, very indicative, just like they're really gross and just stuffing their fat faces and belching, and it reminds me of like Henry Kissinger, just like this Jabba the Hutt just stuffing his fat, disgusting face and making all these grunting and slobbering noises. It's just like, it's really what they're like.
Not even getting any satisfaction out of it either. They're like rotten, you know, like they're not even really enjoying it.
Right.
Yeah. Or they're craving more. They're like more food, or like, it's just not. It's never enough. Like, Mm-hmm.
And then so the Gartham bring in Agra, and she pretty much just kind of like, she doesn't respect him. She's not afraid of him. She just kind of like annoys him. And then you know, the Skeksis then summon the crystal bats more to go out and like find these, because now they know it's Jen and Jen and Kira together. You know, it's getting worse. It's the prophecy is coming true. They're like, we got to find them. So they send out the crystal bats. And then so you have this scene where Jen and Kira are playing music on the canoe, which I thought was very interesting, of sort of that communion of the masculine and feminine, of, you know, he's playing the flute and she's using her voice, and they're playing this beautiful music, and all the creatures on the bankside are kind of like hearing it and coming out and stuff like that. And then the crystal bat flies by, and she's like throws her slingshot at it and knocks it out, but then it pops up and it sees them. And so they, you know, they've been seen, and, you know, again, it transmits that to the Skeksis. And then Kira then brings Jen to the Pod People village. So that's what Brian was mentioning, of like, they're all partying and just being joyful, having music and drinking and this kind of thing. And as Susan mentioned earlier, there's very much, and like, as we get into it, you'll see how much depth there is to this, why we're drawing this parallel of the Pod People being like children. First of all, pod means child. Pedo, you know, like a pediatrician, you know, that means of children. So the Pod People are like these, they look like babies. They have these like chubby round faces, and they're like these kind of beady sparkling eyes, and they're just like, ah, like that. And you know, and again, they get abducted by the Gartham, and you find out later, without getting too into it, that the Skeksis are stealing their essence. So of course that opens up a whole can symbolically of, like, you know, the essence of the children, that innocence, that joy, that inner child that the Skeksis lack. But even more than that, it very much, I think, alludes to the pedophilic culture of the elites, especially like the harvesting of adrenochrome is like stealing their essence, and like for their own, you know, sick use, basically.
Well, and I think it's interesting that you note that, you know, they send like their little their order followers out, and you even see that some of them have kind of cages on their back, and they're harvesting the little pod people, and then they're throwing them in a cage.
Yeah, it's like human trafficking.
And then they're hauling them back, you know, to be in prison. Very much like what the police do. You know, they literally will go out just like they're told to do, and, you know, collect people and throw them in a cage and then take them back in order to be fed on. Like, if you look at the prison system, you know, like energetically feeding them monetarily, or literally like stealing their life, you know, all their time, like keeping them in a cage. It's very symbolic of that same kind of thing, of that role.
Definitely.
Follower.
See, what I got from that too was the idea of the military, because think about what they do. They go to high schools and they pull kids right out of high school, 18 years old, into the military. And I thought it was interesting that the Gartham come and take the children away.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
It's funny that I love that we all three got different takes on that symbolism, because for me, it made me think of CPS, because CPS actually does that. They come and abduct children and put them in, you know, pedophile rings and child trafficking and stuff like that. So lot of different ways you can slice that.
Yeah, and as you were saying, you know, the Gartham, they take the Pod People back, and then we find out that later they're feeding on their essence. But it was something interesting that I noted was they say in the movie that as they remove their essence, then like they just become a slave after that.
They're like zombies.
Their eyes are all glazed over and white, and they're just kind of soulless husks walking around in shackles,
like little meat golems. Yeah, like you know, yeah, exactly.
Totally.
Yeah, so very interesting. A lot of symbolism there.
Yeah. So this kind of is getting close to the end of this segment, which we decided we're going to do in 2 parts. So we're going to start about halfway through the movie. But basically this last scene I thought would be a really great place to end this, because, you know, you just see this jovial, happy culture of Pod People. They're celebrating, and then all of a sudden the Garthium come and just start ensuing chaos and, abducting people, and, parents are trying to find their children and all this kind of stuff. And Jen and Kira are escaping. And first of all, the Skeksil, the Chamberlain, Skeksis, stops the Garthim from chasing after them and lets them go, basically, because he has his own plans, which you'll see later on, of trying to trick them and use them for his own gains. So they escape. And then when they're alone, Jin starts blaming himself. He feels really terrible about that just happens. And he thinks it's because he brought the crystal to the pod people. And, like Susan just said, Kira says, but the Garthim have always come. It's not your fault. And then he gets upset, and he says, I wish I'd never heard of this shard. And he chucks it. And she's like, no, don't. And he throws it away, which, again, symbolically, it's like, I wish I'd never found this knowledge. I wish I'd never discovered my personal responsibility, because now he's blaming himself. He's like taking that. He's feeling the weight of that, which is, that's what people don't want. That's why they abdicate that responsibility.
Ignorance is bliss.
Well,
right.
Allegedly. And so I thought, this is a great place to lead, almost in mystery. Obviously, I'm hoping that all the viewers have seen this movie at least once, but maybe it's been a while and you don't remember the exact timeline. But kind of leaving it open of, he threw this shard away, and you don't really see where it goes, but it leads them to the next place, which will begin the next part 2 of this segment, getting right into that and the significance of why he finds himself again in this place, literally.
Yeah.
So,
and I think, there was something when I saw that scene that it really hit me up where, he says, I wish I never heard of the shard, and he throws it. And it really reminded me of in the Fellowship of the Ring, there's a scene when they're in Moria, and Frodo, he's speaking with Gandalf. He's like, I was saying, I wish the ring had never come to me. And then, because we're the Wizard Factory, we'll share some wizardy knowledge here. A good Gandalf quote that I think is absolutely awesome, and it fits really great with the kind of essence here. And he's like, so do all who live to see such times, but that's not for them to decide. All they have to do is decide what to do with the time that is given to them. And it's this theme that we see, that the hero, when they're going on their journey, and it doesn't matter which story we're covering, there comes a time when they have their purpose, and then they start to feel that weight, that responsibility of it, like Logan was talking about. And then they feel, they kind of get sorry for themselves, or like get a little bit of a victimhood mentality, saying like, I wish this had never happened.
Right. I don't want this responsibility anymore. Get away from me.
Yeah. Instead of recognizing like it's, that's just part of it. That's part of life. And there's a situation there, and you have to choose to deal with it and make the best of it, and, try to make the most positive change that you can.
Right. And whether they're highlighting this or not, the whole point is, you can try to throw that shard away and think that you're going to not be responsible, but it doesn't matter what you do. That responsibility is intrinsic to you. Doesn't matter what lies you tell yourself, or that you voted for such and such and think, well, I did my part. That responsibility cannot be abdicated to anyone else, because that's part of having a consciousness and the free will choice to make change in reality.
And if you put it off, you just have to come back in another 1,000 trying and try all over again.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So, any last thoughts from you guys?
No, I think that's a good place to kind of wrap up the first part, So, for those, if you want to maybe go back and rewatch the movie, like Logan was saying, you can go through and even kind of like watch it up to that part or something. And
it is
episode.
on Netflix. If anyone wants to see it, cheaply, most people already have Netflix, so just go watch it there. But wow, just what rich allegory, and I'm sure we're probably just scratching the surface on this stuff, and I bet we could go on YouTube and find way more in-depth stuff. But this is all just from, we didn't do any research. We just watched the movie and took some notes. So this is all just 100% our authentic thoughts on it. And obviously, we're going to get more in depth into the next half of this one, as well as for those of you who missed it on the last episode about Allegory, we will be eventually getting into the entire series as well, which we're going to do as sort of an offshoot. It won't be part of this podcast, but it's going to be like a 5-part series that we do on this channel. And we're really looking forward to that as well. So let us know in the comments, how did you like our breakdown? This is our first video we're trying like this. So what are your thoughts? Do you think there's anything that we missed? Maybe we can incorporate another theme when we get into part 2 next week. What are some other movies you'd like to see us cover? Let us know down there. Again, if you haven't subscribed, go ahead and hit that button for us. We'd love to have you as part of the channel. And again, for those of you who do not know, we recently released a rune divination course that is still for sale, and that link is down below. So if you're interested in learning more in depth of how, not only about the runes, but how to work with them and form a personal relationship with them, you know, that may be the thing that can help you find more clarity and guidance in your personal journey. So again, click that link below if that's something that interests you. We hope that you've enjoyed this. We'll be back next week as always, but until then, be empowered, inspired, and encouraged.